Senators, I see that we have a quorum, so I'd like to call the meeting to order. Good evening. My name is Fabian Manning. I'm a Senator for Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'm the Chair of the Standing Senate Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. Before I give the floor to our witnesses, I would like to ask our Senators that are here with us this evening if they would introduce themselves, beginning on my immediate right.
Shirley Watt from Nunavik.
Dan Christmas from Nova Scotia.
Eric Forêt du Québec, région du Golfe.
Eric Forêt from the Gulf region in Quebec.
Nancy Rain from British Columbia.
Mark Gold from Quebec.
And Tom McGinnis from Nova Scotia.
And thank you, Senators, and I apologise for our late start, but we just got to finish up in the Senate chamber a few moments ago. The committee is continuing its examination of Bill S-203, an act to amend the Criminal Code and other acts, ending the captivity of whales and dolphins. Pleased this evening to have our witnesses, and I would ask them if they would introduce themselves first before we begin.
Thank you very much for having us. I'm Naomi Rose. I'm the marine mammal scientist for the Animal Welfare Institute in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Rob Laidlaw. I represent a group called Zoocheck. We're based in Toronto, and we've been on the scene in Canada for about 33 years.
And thank you, and I thank our guests for taking their time to be with us here this evening. I understand that you have some opening remarks. We'll hear those, and then we'll go to questions from our senators. So the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. I wanted to focus my remarks today on the fact that Bill S-203 is, for all intents and purposes, just recognizing and codifying much of the existing situation in Canada and what is on the immediate horizon. I actually find it quite curious that Bill S-203 is being opposed by anybody, include my colleagues in the aquarium industry, when it will have such a minimal impact on what they actually do. As you know, Bill S-203 proposes changes to 3 pieces of legislation: the Criminal Code of Canada, the Fisheries Act, and the Wild Animal and Plant Protection and Regulation of International and Interprovincial Trade Act, which we all know as WAPRETA. With regard to the proposed changes to the Criminal Code of Canada, I don't think that they will have any impact whatsoever on the Vancouver Aquarium or on Marineland, the 2 facilities that currently keep cetaceans in Canada, because the cetaceans that they're now keeping would be grandfathered under the law. As well, it should be noted that for the Vancouver Aquarium in 1996, they pledged their intent not to acquire any wild-caught whales, and just recently stated their intention to phase out cetacean keeping entirely by 2029, although a recent Vancouver Park Board vote to prohibit cetaceans in Stanley Park may expedite that process somewhat. In the case of Marineland, they currently hold in excess of 45 belugas, more than all U.S. aquaria combined. So even with no additional imports, it's likely that they will still be displaying belugas 15, 20, or more years into the future, with their numbers declining only incrementally over time. In addition, since the current owner of Marineland is elderly, when the facility does change hands, as it inevitably will, it is entirely possible it may be moved in a different direction, perhaps even involving the sale of the property for another kind of development and the relocation of the whales elsewhere. That is a real possibility. With regard to Bill S-203's proposed changes to the Fisheries Act, it seems to me to be merely codifying into law a situation that has already existed in Canada for quite some time. Orca captures in Canada haven't occurred since the 1970s. The last beluga captures in Canada were in 1992 when the John G. Shedd Aquarium of Chicago came in and captured 4 beluga whales. If the last captures of whales for public display were 25 years ago, that's 2.5 decades ago, then surely enough time has gone by to officially recognize that this practice has ended and will not resume. The proposed changes to WAPRETA are also entirely reasonable and would just be the latest in an extensive series of events in North America that include the following: the U.S. government's denial of the Georgia Aquarium's application to allow the import of 18 wild-caught beluga whales from Russia. That government's designation of Russia's Sakhalin Bay Amur River beluga population, the population of belugas most heavily exploited by the aquarium industry and reportedly the source of many of Marineland's belugas, as depleted, ending all U.S. trade in individuals from that population. SeaWorld's announcement that they will no longer breed orcas, use them in theatrical shows, and that they will in fact be phasing orcas out of their facilities entirely. The state of California codifying into law parts of that corporate policy by banning orca breeding and shows. Ontario's banning on the keeping and import of orca whales. The National Aquarium announcing the retirement of its dolphins to a seaside sanctuary. And of course, the aforementioned Vancouver Aquarium pledge in 1996 not to acquire wild-caught whales, their recent announced phase-out of cetacean keeping by 2029, and the subsequent vote by the Vancouver Park Board just a few weeks ago to prohibit cetacean keeping in Stanley Park. In my view, Bill S-203 is a very conservative bill that simply formalizes much of what is already happening or that is on the horizon, and it does so in a way that shouldn't be onerous to any stakeholder. As I said, there are only 2 facilities in Canada currently keeping cetaceans for public display. The Vancouver Aquarium, which has announced its intention to get out of the cetacean keeping business, and the privately owned Marineland, which has enough whales to keep their pools populated probably for decades. Given the circumstances, I couldn't imagine a better time for a bill like S-203. In closing, I would like to point out that this is an easy thing for Canada to do. It comes at no political cost, and it would be applauded throughout the world, just as other initiatives of this kind have been in the past. This is a win-win situation for everybody involved, and it is exactly for those reasons that I encourage you to facilitate Bill S-203 moving on through the legislative process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Laidlaw. Ms. Rose.
Thank you very much again for having us here. I'm a cetacean biologist, and this is how I'm going to approach my testimony. It's from that direction. And as a cetacean biologist, I believe that these species inherently cannot thrive in captivity. They have certain biological and ecological characteristics that make it very difficult for them to thrive in captivity. Professionally, I've been addressing this question of the welfare of captive whales and dolphins for about 25 years. And I formulated arguments against the practice of keeping these animals in captivity that are science-based. In the early years of this debate, the arguments were largely ethical, but now we know so much more about them from studies that have been conducted starting in the 1960s and the 1970s, and now with technology they are moving forward into the 21st century with drone technology, more advanced tags, and so on. We know so much more about them ecologically and biologically that we can now formulate these science-based arguments to demonstrate, for example, when the best that any zoo or aquarium, the finest state-of-the-art facilities, can only provide these animals with space that is 1/10,000th of 1% of their natural home ranges. The smallest identified home range for a dolphin or an orca, 1/10,000th of 1% is all we can give them in captivity. Common sense alone, let alone science, argues that this is a species, this is a taxon that cannot be provided for adequately in captivity. Sorry. I know that dolphinariums often the zoo community in general often argues that people will only protect and love what they know. And by this they mean that people have to see and touch and interact with these animals to learn to love them and want to protect them. And that's why we need zoos and aquariums. That's what they say. However, if this pro-captive display argument is true, then that means that there's an awful lot of species who are doomed to extinction, and I don't think this is where the zoos and aquariums mean for their logic to go. All right. Humpback whales are not held in captivity, and yet people love them, and they are recovering. Here, on the east coast of North America, they are recovering, and nobody's ever seen one in captivity. So clearly that argument that you must see the living animal, touch it, and interact with it is not true, and thankfully so. So I fully support S-203. I think it's a very reasonable law. I think it's a very rational approach to this. It grandfathers in the existing animals. It gives the zoo and aquarium community a long phase-out period. It is not asking these facilities to close overnight. But I'd also like to point out that, as Mr. Laidlaw pointed out, that this trend is already happening. You are riding a wave with this bill that is already crested and is leading into the shore. All right, Virgin Holidays, TripAdvisor, most recently Thomas Cook, have restricted their promotion of swim with the dolphin encounters in holiday destinations. Costa Rica, India, California, and South Carolina, and my country, and even your own province of Ontario have restricted the display of these species already. So these things are already happening, as Mr. Laidlaw pointed out. This is not anything new. It's the culmination of 25 years of work for me, and I'm really quite excited about the future. And I think what the future holds is seaside sanctuaries, and I think you've already heard some about that already. And there are 5 viable projects currently underway around the world, 2 in Europe, and well, actually 3 in Europe and 2 in North America. 4 of them are for bottlenose dolphins, and 1 is for a cold water sanctuary that would be capable of housing belugas or orcas, or even Pacific white-sided dolphins, any cold water species. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a lot of money. We're not unrealistic about that, but there are sanctuaries, as Mr. Laidlaw can certainly explain to you, for terrestrial wildlife all around the world. Bears, elephants, tigers. The concept is not new. It's just the taxon that would be new for the sanctuary community. So how you raise funds for those sorts of large charismatic megafauna is the same. You know, the business model, if you will, is the same. So we're not proposing something that's that radical. It is a little different because these animals are, of course, marine, but in terms of the business model, it's established. So that's the future we would like to move toward, but again, this bill doesn't even, require that. And no bill that I know of currently that's being considered seriously would require that. They're all grandfathering in the animals that currently are in captivity and giving the zoo and aquarium community a chance to phase out the practice. So again, I think it's very reasonable, and I fully support it, and I thank you very much for considering it so thoughtfully. As an American, I have to really express my gratitude for your thoughtful consideration of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rose. And we'll go to our first questions from Senator Tom McGuinness.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for being here. This, as you can appreciate, is an extremely emotional issue, and we as the committee have heard and will continue to hear all sides of this issue. And the challenge in the end is for us to make the proper decision. And certainly we will have considerable evidence from all sides. Can I ask, look, what is the value, if you could quantify it, of the educational aspect of seeing these mammals in captivity versus what you can see in the wild? What is that, and how effective, if we didn't have these, how effective would the examination and the studies would be in the wild that we would lose out if we didn't have these aquariums? And secondly, if you could, give a further explanation. We had I forget her name, doctor here last Thursday morning, talking about
Dr. Marino.
Yeah, the seaside sanctuaries. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I'm trying to. I'd love to have one, as I said the other Thursday, have one off the shores of Nova Scotia. We could have one. I'm not quite sure how they would operate, and how they would replace the aquariums. Could you just talk about that?
So I'm going to propose a rather radical sort of turn your question on its head. I actually think zoos and aquariums, when it comes to certain species, and all whales and dolphins fall into this category for me, harm education. I actually find them unhelpful in the extreme because they are almost all in commercial facilities. Not all. There are several municipal or nonprofit facilities, but for the most part, I mean, it's a very expensive proposition to keep these animals, so they do need to make money, and so they charge a fairly hefty entrance fee, even when they're nonprofit. And when they're for-profit, $100 will get you through the gate, for the day. And when you're a family of 4, that's a lot of money. So when you've got that kind of profit motive, your corporate education isn't necessarily going to be that accurate. And in fact, again, as a cetacean biologist, I can tell you a lot of what these facilities, Marineland in particular is a really good example of that. Not so much the Vancouver Aquarium, but Marineland for sure. What you're hearing about these animals once you're inside the gate is almost entirely incorrect. The flopped over dorsal fin of orcas, the social behavior of dolphins, the amount of distance they cover, how deep they can dive. Bottlenose dolphins can dive up to 1,300 feet. 450 meters. The deepest tank, the deepest sea pen anywhere in the world is 10 meters. So when a child goes and sees a dolphin performing in a show, they don't see reality. They're seeing a facade. They're seeing a mask. They're seeing something that's actually false. And as a scientist and as an advocate, and even as an educator, because I do a lot of lectures and so on, I find that very disturbing. So I actually think part of the reason we're having some trouble with our conservation of the marine environment these days is because people go to places like Marineland or SeaWorld or any other, a Swim with a Dolphin program in the Caribbean and think everything's fine with whales and dolphins. They're all happy and jumping around and performing for you. And no, you wouldn't allow that if there was anything wrong with the oceans. You being the powers that be, wouldn't allow that. If there was anything wrong with the oceans or anything wrong with their populations, when in fact there's a lot wrong with them. I work at the International Whaling Commission Scientific Committee, and I follow the conservation issues, and there's a lot wrong with the oceans these days. And I actually think the zoos and aquariums are making it worse when it comes to these species, not all species, but these species, because they have to pretty much lie to the public to make it seem okay that they're actually in this box of water, and they can't even dive, beyond 10 meters. So that's the answer to your first question. I don't think we would lose anything. I think we would actually gain if we ended the display of these animals. I think high-tech, CGI, animatronics, just animation, and whale watching, responsible whale watching, a good book, a good coffee table book with some fantastic photographs can replace a show at Marineland very, very well, and in fact, far, far better. So that's the educational answer. As far as the Seaside Sanctuary, I am on the board of directors of the same sanctuary that Dr. Marino described to you, and what we're proposing there is netting off a bay or a cove and giving them a lot more space. That's really the goal. These are wide-ranging predators, and they're really, really constrained in how much they can move. And because they're so intelligent and so social, I think it kind of drives them a little bit, if not crazy, then at least into a bit of a depression, and they don't thrive. So this is an attempt to allow them to thrive, even though they'll still be restricted in their space, even though they'll still be cared for by people, because they're not competent to survive in the wild. I assure you of that. They are not competent to survive in the wild for the most part. We would still care for them in a sanctuary, but they would have more space. How it would work legally and logistically, it's never been done before, so we're learning as we go. But again, the business model has already been established with other species, large, charismatic megafauna like elephants, tigers, bears. There are sanctuaries. Primates, intelligent social animals. We've provided sanctuaries for all of those taxa. So this is not, starting de novo. We are working from an established model.
Now, with regard to, I'll go back to the educational argument. I can't really comment on the experience of people when they're viewing animals in the wild, but this is something my organization has looked at, including very recently, with regard to zoo and aquarium displays. And what we found when we've examined the scientific literature, so the peer-reviewed journal articles that are published on Google Scholar, Web of Science, that are on all of these types of scientific search engines, is that there are a number of papers, dozens and dozens and dozens of them, in fact, and very few, if any of them, actually support the contention that the casual visitor going to a zoo or aquarium looking at animals for a period of time actually learn in the way that zoos and aquariums claim they do. There's actually very little evidence to that, and actually a lot of evidence showing that they actually don't learn anything at all. But perhaps more importantly, because zoos and aquariums claim that they are creating legions of conservationists that go out into the field and change their behavior to benefit animals and to benefit the environment, there's no evidence that that occurs at all. The post-zoo visit or post-aquarium visit behavior of people who have attended and looked at animals or read some of the factoids that are on the graphics that are accompanying cages and pools and tanks, those things are not taken home. They don't change behavior one iota, and there's no evidence for it. The other things you have to think about when you're looking at these animals is that you've got animals that are displayed completely out of their ecological context. These are animals that are like fragments of nature in a very alien type of context, so that people can readily and conveniently come and see them. About all you can really see for a lot of these animals is their size, shape, and color. And even for that, that's not always accurate, because if you look at an animal like the Przewalski's horse, their color phases will change. If you look at polar bears, as they lose their musculature, they become pear-shaped. They don't look like polar bears in the wild. If you look at tigers or lions or other big cats, and I've seen them in the wild, the obese animals that are in captivity, that are obese because of lack of activity and because they just can't do anything they should normally be able to do if they were in the wild, they don't look like those animals in the wild. So at most, you're going to see something that's vaguely reminiscent of the animal in the wild in terms of size, shape, and color. You're not going to learn anything about patrolling a home range territory, finding mates, normal maternal behaviors in animals, how they form their personal relationships with each other and with extended families or with other animals in their home ranges. You're not learning anything about that. And I would challenge anyone to really show that casual visitors actually learn anything based, if nothing else, by the length of time that people look at animals. We've actually done surveys at Toronto Zoo and at other facilities that show that between the average length of time viewing animals is between about 8 and about 90 seconds. I challenge anybody to convince me or show me any evidence that you can actually learn much looking at an animal from between 8 and 90 seconds. When we were working to get the Toronto Zoo elephants out of the Toronto Zoo, there were internal surveys done at the zoo, and we did our own look at people. We did sample sizes of 500, so 2 sample sizes, and we found that the average length of time people looked at the elephants, which are, the big attraction animals, the most charismatic animals at the zoo that you would expect everybody to run to and wait and watch, 77 seconds was the average length of time. And the polls done internally in the zoo showed that people didn't really care if the elephants were there or not. They just wanted animals to see because they were coming for a nice day out. It's the same for the aquarium. So even if you look at the time that people spend at exhibits, it's really sort of beyond reasonableness to say that people are learning much, except perhaps in some cases the size, shape, and color of the animals. Now, what zoos have done, because if you look at the academic literature in the zoo world, and I'm talking about materials that are coming from zoo people themselves, they acknowledge that, hey, this factoid-based graphics presentation of information, their narration on shows, which is usually very simplistic and also factoid-based, it doesn't work. All you have to do is look at the literature and you'll see that. So what they've moved to is this idea that they are connecting people with wildlife. When you go and you look at that gorilla and stare him in the eye, or you go up and you see that beluga whale and stare that beluga whale in the eye, that somehow, magically, there's this transformation that occurs in people, and they leave the zoo and forever their lives are changed and they're out there trying to help wildlife. Well, there's no evidence for that. They actually have a term for that. It's called the zoo proposition, this amorphous connection that people are supposed to get. And what I say to that is, number one, there's no proof, but number two, there are all kinds of better ways of creating a connection with wildlife. I write children's books. I'm working on my 10th book now about bats. They're in thousands of schools and libraries all across North America and in other countries. And I've had the opportunity to go and talk to literally tens of thousands of kids from coast to coast. And I can tell you, they don't need to see the animal in the cage. Now, we often hear, well, my child or my neighbor's child or, went to the zoo, or the old person, the senior citizen went to the zoo and they had a smile on their face and there was this connection. Well, I can tell you by talking to all these kids that if they have full disclosure, when they go and they don't know anything about the experience of the animals, when they don't know anything about the behavioral ecology and natural history of the animals, and they think everything's okay and that these animals are safeguarded, then they come away with a smile on their face. But if there's full disclosure, if they have some understanding about what they're actually looking at, about how these animals live in the wild, then those smiles quickly vanish. And it doesn't matter if they're 7 years old or 70 years old. I've seen it time and time again. When you have full disclosure of the information, that connection, that smile vanishes. There are better ways of doing this.
I appreciate the time, but we have a long list of questionnaires,
sorry.
And I do hesitate at all times to cut anybody off. I don't like doing that, but I am going to start sticking to some time limits here because we're running a bit late and we have a lot of questionnaires. So, Senator McGuinness, you finish very, very quickly.
Very, very quick.
And a very quick answer.
Because you present a compelling case, both of you, and obviously have some knowledge. But we're going to hear from a doctor who is a veterinarian for 45 years at Marineland. And let me just quote what he testified before the Ontario legislature when they were putting, I think it was Bill 80, through there. And speaking of Kista, the killer whale, she has, and I'm quoting, she has been observed by 30 million people teaching the public about killer whales and marine life. It is a tribute to Marineland for teaching and making the public aware of these magnificent animals. The mammals held there are stress-free, psychologically fit, and overall healthy, unquote. So that's the comment that's made by a veterinarian that's been there, and so that's the dichotomy. That's the discussion that is going to take place. So that's the other side of the coin.
And I totally appreciate that. And this is, unfortunately for you all, it can sound a bit he said, she said. But when you look at the data, when you look into the literature, Kiska is a really good example. I know who you're talking about, Dr. Lanny Cornell. Kiska is completely abnormal. There's nothing normal about her. Yes, she's been viewed by 30 million people, and every single one of those people, if they had a good day at Marineland, walked away with a false image of killer whales. I'm a killer whale biologist. I spent years in the field with these animals up in British Columbia, here in Canada. Kiska is completely abnormal. I've spent hours watching her as well. And there's nothing about her that teaches any child an accurate picture of killer whales. And again, I go back to my previous comment. I actually think Kiska is harming our ability to teach young people how much these animals need from us in the wild to thrive, to be protected, to be conserved. So, with all due respect to Dr. Cornell, he's simply defending his own career. It isn't true that those 30 million people learned anything at all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McGuinness. I stress time constraints, Senator Plett. I've been around for a long time.
Chair, hopefully the answers will then accommodate that, because That's where our problem was in the last question, not in the questioner. My question, Ms. Rose, first of all, and I have a list of questions, so cut me off, Chair, when you want, and then I'll go on the next round. I want to talk a little bit about your certification, first of all, and these are very brief, and I don't think we need a long answer. Are you a board-certified veterinarian?
Absolutely not.
Not, thank you. What was your PhD topic?
The social dynamics of killer whales in British Columbia.
Thank you. And when was your last peer-reviewed paper on whales and dolphins, and what was it on?
I'm working, well, I would just say last year or the year before, and I work on policy issues mostly now. Obviously, I'm not in the field anymore.
But you have done a
peer-reviewed paper? Absolutely. I've published over 40 of them.
Would you be able to send that?
I would love to, yeah,
committee?
absolutely.
Thank you very much. I understand you are, and first of all, let me apologize, Chair. We have a few too many things going on today and late out of the chamber and so on and so forth, so I apologize for my tardiness here. You are, Ms. Rose, a proponent of placing whales and dolphins into sea pens, I think. Now, you call them sanctuaries or sea pens? What are they?
There are already sea pens all around the world. These are dolphinariums, public display facilities, mostly swim with the dolphin programs, and they are, if you're familiar with the kinds of pens that tuna are raised in or whatever, you know, that's what we're talking about. They are net pens in the marine environment, usually right next to a shore. And what we're talking about with seaside sanctuaries is netting off a bay or a cove that is conservatively 50 to 100 times larger than that.
Okay, similar to what we had, I think, our previous witness talk about.
Yes, exactly.
Talking about sanctuaries. Thank you. But you are a proponent of sea pens, and you have been quoted as saying the idea that sea pens in and of themselves are dangerous is utterly ludicrous.
Yes, I said that.
That would be your assertion that
just because this came from SeaWorld saying sea cages, which is what they call them, are dangerous. That's their quote. And I was responding to that claim that sea cages are dangerous. That, on its face, is a baseless comment.
Thank you. Your sanctuary, where would you get your... and I need to make one comment here, and maybe I shouldn't have, but I was with her, the killer whale. She looked pretty normal to me, but anyway, again, I'm not a professional either, but she looked pretty normal, smiling to me when I put my hand on her. And
they smile even when they're dead.
Well, fair enough. So do people occasionally. Where would you get your whales from for your sanctuary?
From the public display community.
Like, how would you get them? Would you import them? Would you?
If it depends on where they are, where the sanctuary is, and where the animals are. They might be imported.
They might be.
They might be transported within about the borders of a single country.
So, are you supportive of the part of the bill that says no person shall import into Canada or export from Canada a cetacean, including a whale, dolphin, or porpoise, whether living or dead, or sperm, a tissue culture, or an embryo of a cetacean? If you, in fact, are a supporter of possibly...
My understanding is that there's an exemption for certain
No, there's no
practices.
exemption there. It's very clear. Section 4 of the bill, the Wild Animal and Plant Protection and Regulation of the International and International Provincial Trade Act is amended by adding the following after Section 7, and just what I quoted. So are you supportive of that section of the bill?
I was involved in the passage of the bill in California, and we had a provision in that bill, which is now law, to allow animals to be transported to seaside sanctuaries.
This one doesn't. Are you supportive of that part of the bill?
I would want that possibility.
Okay, so you're not supportive of that. Mr. Laidlaw.
I am supportive of that provision with amendments.
Yeah, no, but you're not supportive of that part of the bill.
Yes, I am, with amendments for that exemption. Okay. Every bill has exemptions, sir.
Well, yeah, this one, and the sponsor said that he would propose some amendments, but certainly not that one. Mr. Laidlaw, did your organization participate in the province of Ontario's 2-year process to develop its regulations? And if so, can you describe the level of engagement and steps Ontario took to study the issue of the new regulations for cetaceans in captivity?
The Ontario government convened a fast-track consultation process with a number of different players. They involved internal government players as one group of stakeholders. They involved animal welfare groups as a second group of stakeholders, industry members as a third group of stakeholders, and there were a sort of other people that contributed to the process. The fast-track consultation then led to various drafts of regulations that were circulated to the various stakeholders for comments, and then the government internally worked with that commentary and developed their standards that were then circulated. Those standards, there was process that they went through where all of the stakeholders could provide additional commentary, and then eventually they were incorporated into Regulation 6009 of the Ontario Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act.
Can I ask one more very short one, Chair? Thank you. Did the province of Ontario review consider the needs of belugas in captivity when developing regulations? I know Ontario determined that no new orcas should be bred or transferred to captivity in the province. Can you tell us what the decision of the Ontario regulations, what the decision was regarding belugas?
Well, with regard to belugas, they, well, let me just backstep a second. The animal welfare groups that were involved in the consultation unanimously agreed in that all cetaceans should be given equal consideration under the law. The government had identified certain criteria that were used for their position on orca whales, but those criteria applied equally to other cetaceans. So all of the animal welfare groups had advocated that there be also a prohibition extended to include the other cetaceans. The Ontario government, I am not fully aware of their motivations for this, but they, I guess, were trying to find a middle ground between all the stakeholders, and they chose not to do that. I think there was also a little bit of politics there. They knew that banning orcas was an easy thing to do. It's unlikely there would be more orcas ever coming into the province. They grandfathered the only existing orca in the province, and they could get very good optics from it, which is exactly what they achieved. So I think there was a little bit of several things occurring. They were looking for middle ground. They didn't want to go very far with this, even though the trend, on a continent-wide basis and globally is definitely moving in a certain direction, and they were able to achieve their good optics and check their political checklist with what they did. So
my question, though, was specifically what was the decision regarding belugas?
The decision was to have the Ontario SPCA try to mitigate concerns about the keeping of belugas in captivity through Regulation 6009.
Thank you, Chair. I'll go in the second round if we have time.
Okay, thank you, Senator Pitt. Senator Gold.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This is a question for you, Dr. Rose. You alluded to the artificiality of the environments within which the cetaceans are kept in captivity, and suggested the harm that they might suffer, psychological and other. Could you elaborate on the harm, physical and other, to cetaceans based upon your research to cetaceans in captivity?
Thank you. Yes. The U.S. government just recently underwent a regulatory process to update their care and maintenance regulations for captive marine mammals, all marine mammals. And there was a public comment period. And so for the purposes of that, I spent a great deal of time researching the literature to try to find what the latest knowledge of the ecology and biology of these animals was. And it ranged from whales and dolphins, seals and sea lions, polar bears, manatees, etc. How far do they range? How deep do they dive? How large are their group sizes? How long do they live? What diseases afflict them? and so on. I examined I got a couple of interns in, and we really dug deep into the scientific literature. And then I ended up writing a 60-page comment letter with 140 references to try to address my concerns with the current care and maintenance regulations in the U.S., which are considered pretty normal for the world, and what I wanted them to be. And so I am actually trying to work within the system to improve the welfare of these animals, understanding that they're not all going to go to a sanctuary tomorrow. This practice is not going to disappear overnight. Their welfare is being harmed right now, and I was trying to work within the system to try to improve that welfare. So what is it that is harmful? One of the studies I found actually was conducted in Mexico, and it determined that when animals are held, when dolphins, bottlenose dolphins, are held in sea pens versus in concrete tanks, they swim more, they log less, and if you don't know what logging is, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's when a cetacean hangs motionless in the water like a log. It is extraordinarily rare to see that in the wild, but it is extremely common in captivity. So they swim more, they log less, they have lower cortisol levels. Cortisol is a stress hormone, chronic stress hormone. So those are what happen when you hold them in a sea pen, those things happen versus in a tank. So they have higher stress levels, swim less, and log more when they're in a concrete tank. And it took some finding to find that study. That work, that kind of basic animal welfare science, is not being done in North America other than Mexico. It's not being done in Europe. It's not being done anywhere except this one study that I found in Mexico. So what it showed me was that when they're in natural habitat, and if I had to take a guess as a biologist, I would say it's an acoustic issue as well as a space issue, because in fact the sea pens were larger than the tanks as well as being acoustically more natural. These are extraordinarily acoustically based animals. They listen, hear far better than we do, up into very high frequencies. And when they're in tanks, one, the tank doesn't change from day to day, so they kind of shut down their echolocation. They can still use it. It functions perfectly well, but they don't use it very often. And that study has also been done. They decrease the use of their echolocation when they're in captivity in a tank. But they actually listen to pump noises all day long. They listen to all sorts of vibrations that come through the concrete walls that are low frequency and disturbing, sort of like living near an airport, if you will. All right? And that's hard enough on human beings. When you are an acoustic animal, as opposed to a visual one, it's worse. So in a sea pen, where at least they have, no concrete walls, where everything sort of is transmitted through the concrete and the vibrations are actually felt through the water column, they're living in a more natural acoustic environment that actually helps them. And apparently it shows in their salivary cortisol levels and in their swimming behavior and in their logging behavior. And so another thing that I discovered, and this was not something I actually really wanted to hear, but I go where the data take me. The U.S. Navy has 70 bottlenose dolphins in captivity in sea pens in San Diego Harbor. I don't particularly like that program. It's military use of wildlife. I don't really like it. But the data show that these animals live longer than dolphins in tanks. And they, again, they've been there since 1955 or so, that program. And so they had a lot of data on a lot of animals and how long they live. And they determined that their survival rates, because they keep them in sea pens and also take them for ocean walks. If you know anything about the Navy program, then you know that they actually take the animals out for walks. They retrieve ordnance, they dive deep. They get to dive deep, all right? And apparently it allows them to live longer. And the last thing, just one more thing. Yep. They also seem to suffer from more diseases. Because of the low-level stress that the cortisol levels show, they tend to get pneumonia, septicemia, erysipelas fairly frequently, far more frequently than is seen in stranded animals, wild animals, and so on.
Thank you. And if you could send references of any of the material.
I would be happy to send you the comment letter I wrote, which has all the references, and they're actually the PDFs are actually available through that comment letter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gold. Senator Verga.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. My question is more like with the seaside sanctuaries. I mean, there's that one that exists yet that can handle, let's say, a beluga whale. Is there any seaside sanctuaries that exist already?
I would like to request that we not get too hung up on the seaside sanctuary concept because, one, the bill doesn't address it, and two, none exist yet. We're working on it. We are working on it, but absolutely none exist yet. It is a concept at the moment that we're trying to turn into reality. We're not asking any of the facilities in Canada to retire their animals to seaside sanctuaries. We think if we build one, they will come. But the fact is that this grandfathers them in. It allows them to keep displaying them and making money off of them into the future, as Mr. Laidlaw said.
Yeah, but that's the alternative you're giving us. I mean, those existing whales and cetaceans in the tanks. Those are the alternative you're telling us. I mean, to put it in seaside sanctuaries.
That is an alternative we would like to offer, but we can't force the issue.
Yeah, but the thing is, it's not proven yet, right? That it's really is good for the cetaceans.
In practice, it has never been done.
Never been done.
Conceptually, right? The concept has been proven for terrestrial mammals.
So technically, it's just a theory that it will be good for the seaside sanctuaries.
We are pursuing the theory, absolutely.
The theory, but then have you? Let's say it's a theory, right? Have you ever?
I will say though, sea pens, as I mentioned to the senator, exist. They are dolphinariums. They are swim with mostly in the Caribbean, in Israel, and the engineering of how you work with these animals in sea pens has been established. We would not be reinventing the wheel entirely.
Yeah, but those are just small. They're like dolphins, right?
Absolutely.
It's
they are much smaller than what we are envisioning.
Big seaside,
absolutely.
Sea pen, right? So what I'm worried about with creating a big seaside sanctuaries is that you're gonna put a net right in the cove, or maybe some huge swath of water. I mean. What I'm worried about that is that you're going to put a predator right in there permanently, and it will disturb the ecosystem of the whole place you're going to enclose. So
it is.
It will be. It's between. It's kind of a different and difficult for those animals right in there. Right.
There are criteria that we would have to meet. Including, environmental assessments that most governments would require, but there are criteria that we, for our own purposes, would have to meet in terms of water flow, tidal changes, water turnover would be key, absolutely.
So have you found a place, something like that?
We're working on it.
We're working on it.
I don't mean to be flip, but we are working on it.
There you go, because at this point, there's no point for us to maybe ban this, because to approve this, because there's no alternative for those existing cetaceans in the aquariums. Right?
I don't mean to be disrespectful, but that's not what the bill even addresses anyway. It grandfathers in these animals. They get to stay where they are. They would live out their lives in the facilities they're in. They would continue to be displayed. The theme park would continue to have roller coasters, and eventually, this species would no longer be held over time. I think it's a really reasonable proposal to phase it out over time. It gives them plenty of time to transition to a new business model.
Okay, but this time it's not an alternative.
At this time, it is not an alternative. That's just logical. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Berger. Senator Forrest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for being with us here today to share your knowledge with us. Your arguments specifically concern... Can you hear? So your arguments specifically concern...
The acoustic.
Cetaceans, particularly given their acoustic sensitivities, because what you are saying, what your diagnosis is that a wild animal or wild mammal, whether it's an elephant, a lion, or a cetacean in captivity, we don't find ourselves with an ideal situation. And our bill specifically concerns cetaceans. Now, the law of nature is one that is fair. It is pitiless, but it also has no preferences. And so are there not cases, as an example, a wounded animal, if we leave it alone in nature, might find itself attacked by other predators? So are there not certain cases, as is the case for some humans, that we have to keep in secure facilities for their own well-being? Are there not certain cases where is the possibility of keeping this kind of individual in acceptable conditions Would it not be in their best interest?
Actually, the data indicate exactly the opposite. There have been several meta-analyses of large, wide-ranging predators, carnivores, including tigers, polar bears, and a couple of other species. What seems to be key is the territory they cover, their wide-ranging nature. If they are predators, carnivores, and they have small home ranges, they adjust to captivity relatively well. If they are wide-ranging in their ecology, they do very poorly in captivity. This is a meta-analysis of many species, and I would argue that the most wide-ranging of all predators are the cetaceans. Orcas cover hundreds of miles, tens of thousands of miles in a year, hundreds of miles in a day. Bottlenose dolphins, the smallest home range I could identify was 600,000 square meters. That's the smallest home range. Most of them live in tens of square kilometers of, or hundreds of square kilometers of home range. So they are wide-ranging predators by definition. And this meta-analysis, which was published in Nature, which is one of the most prestigious journals there is, indicated that they live shorter lives than their wild counterparts. They breed more poorly. They have lower birth rates than their wild counterparts, and they have more stereotypies, the pacing behavior, the neuroses that you see. Interestingly, going back to Senator Plett, you mentioned that the photograph you took of Kiska, she looked perfectly normal to you. That photograph is actually of a stance that you never see in the wild. When their head is up out of the water and their mouth is open, that's a captive animal. They never do that in the wild. That smile is just, she's begging for food. And it never is seen in the wild. I spent hundreds of hours watching these animals in the wild. Dr. Cornell never has, by the way. And they don't do that. And it's because, just logically, you just need to think about that. Food comes from the sky in captivity. It's below the surface of the water in the wild. So these are animals that need those characteristics of their habitat. They need space. They need prey, or they develop these problems.
Mais on est d'accord. Moi, la question que je vous...
Well, the question I was really asking, and I come from Rimouski in the Gulf region where we have a lot of belugas and a lot of whales as well. A wounded individual, if I understand correctly, you would prefer to leave it in nature, that it would be taken by a predator. So are there not cases, as it is with some humans, where they need to be in institutions for their own protection? So are there not certain cases in the population that for their own good, despite the constraints involved, that we could at that point in time keep them in such an environment? And perhaps your seaside reserve would be a better option. But given that nature doesn't make any distinctions, we say the law of nature is pitiless. That's what it is. And so in that context, I imagine that for some individuals, it might be preferable to be in a captivity.
I am not a proponent better dead than in captivity. I do believe that there are some animals that when they are stranded or rescued from injuries or illness, especially if those injuries and illness are human-caused, then I do believe that it is our responsibility to rescue those animals and rehabilitate them, and there will be some that cannot be released again. And if they cannot be released again, for example, those animals would always be available for research, whether they're in a public display facility or they're in a seaside sanctuary. I don't think we're ever going to run out of a supply of cetaceans to study in captivity because of the stranding issue and the rescue issue. And what we, again, would like to do with our seaside sanctuaries is offer an alternative. It doesn't exist yet, but we're working to make it reality.
Can I just add one comment with regard to animals that are injured or in other kinds of need of assistance? I think you have to deal with it on a case-by-case basis. And if you look at the rehabilitation community for terrestrial wildlife, you'll see that there's an established ethic of humane euthanasia. If an animal can't be put into a circumstance where its needs are actually going to be met, so its biological, behavioral, and social needs are going to be met, then that ethic dictates that perhaps that animal should be euthanized. I think you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, and at the core of whatever decision is made, it's got to be, can that animal's needs be met? And if not, then I think you need to make that difficult decision to do the right thing and not put that animal into that circumstance.
I'd like to make a final comment, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Indeed, when you claim that there's an educational function of some of these facilities that could be debatable, I agree. But there's clearly a whole function of raising awareness, of being in touch with this kind of fauna. So there's at least that element. But in terms of education, I don't think it works either.
Just make a couple of comments with regard to education.
Short one.
I'll try. And actually, I'll finish my previous answer. I think there's all kinds of other ways of doing it. I think there are all kinds of different facilities. There are specialist breeding facilities. There are conservation centers. There are sanctuaries. There are all kinds of other models out there that are not really putting a great cost on the animals themselves, that present animals in an entirely different way than you would in a zoo where people have unfettered access to look at animals. I would also like to point out that, as Dr. Rose said, there's these tremendous new technologies. In fact, I'm familiar with two recently, Light Animal, which is indoor whale watching out of Japan. I was actually in communication with the inventor of this, and that's where you go in and on the walls of auditoriums or buildings you have projections, life-size projections of dolphins and humpback whales. But what's really interesting, and this really engages kids, is that they're interactive. If you go up and touch them, they will interact with you. There's all kinds of innovative technologies like that, and in fact there's a whole new facility called Orbi Zoo in Japan. That's a fantastic immersive experience with wildlife that has no live animals. It's all technologically based. There's all kinds of other examples of ways you can learn and connect with animals. So, as I said before, I don't think people are learning from the signs and just looking at animals, but I think there are better ways to do it that don't cost the animals anything.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Forrest. Senator Watt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. I'm going to cover only the belugas because I don't know enough about the other species that you seems to be concerned about. Well, I do believe that the belugas have their needs. Belugas have their needs. Would you agree that belugas are a migration species?
Yes.
You do.
They are migratory species.
So each month they move into different areas and so on when they're migrating through the ocean.
Correct.
Along the coast.
Yes.
And that given month, they might have that particular needs, which we don't have a very clear understanding at this moment because of the lack of technology availability. Would you agree to that?
Technology is improving, but it is
but we don't
difficult
have it
to
all
study. You are correct. It is difficult to study belugas because of their marginal habitat, their lack of a dorsal fin. It's hard to put a tag on them and so on. Yes.
Exactly. So there's a time that the belugas have to go through have to get into the fast water in order to be able to cleanse themselves.
Right. They molt.
Yeah, and they change their skin.
They do.
Our responsibility as an Aboriginal person, as a hunter, that we are not allowed to interfere when they're in their destination, when they're going into the fresh water to molt.
It's a very high energy endeavor. It drains them, and so that's an appropriate.
Exactly.
I think that's an appropriate management.
And that is
rule.
a very important part of what we have to protect as an Aboriginal people, as hunters, to make sure that they carry on what they're supposed to do in terms of their migration. So I'm glad to hear that there is an understanding from the people that have tendency to deal with animals under the captivities. And I, for one, makes me feel uneasy when I see an animal. It doesn't matter what kind of an animal that might be. It could be migratory birds, or they could be marine mammals, or animal on top of the land, whatever. It's just knowing the fact, if you put yourself into that and you're not familiar with that, an amount of stress that probably apply to that one given species under the captivity. And at the same time, not being able to identify and know when they are crying for a change. That I do believe we don't have that technology to understand a species when they're crying for change.
Would you
agree?
I agree, and I think that one of the things that bothers me the most about holding this particular species in captivity is it is an Arctic species. It is specially adapted, supremely well adapted to live in that environment, yep. And that environment cannot be provided in captivity. Again, one of the most recent new pieces of data that came out about belugas is that they can dive to 900 meters.
Correct.
Again, the deepest tank I know of is 10 meters.
And that itself alone would provide a tremendous amount of stress on the animal.
Yes, absolutely. Being unable to dive when that is what you are adapted to do would be extremely stressful.
True. Mr. Chairman, as a human beings, if we are put under certain captivity, or under a certain a box, if you want to call it that, or in jail, just imagine putting yourself into that, and that's how they behave, and that's how they feel a stress within their own environment. Whether that animal should be released, I have some doubts whether that animal will survive if they were under the captivity for a certain number of years. And I don't think it would survive. I don't think they would know how to survive.
I agree. They are intelligent animals who learn by cultural transmission, and so if their culture is captivity, they wouldn't know how to survive in the wild. This is precisely why we're trying to develop sanctuaries, because they cannot and should not, from a humane perspective, be released.
If I understood you correctly, Dr. Rose, one of your point is recommending something better than holding them under a tight captivity and placing them into a more natural habitat. So I'm thinking of the way they do in certain countries, and I don't believe we do that yet, and except maybe in Newfoundland area, that we do keep the salmon and fish under the captivity, isn't open, fence them and
farming,
in the open water.
Fish farming. Yeah.
That also have a negative components to the fact that maybe certain amount of disease could develop the same
Absolutely.
way that it do disease developed on the salmon when you keep them under the open captivity. So I'm just wondering whether anybody have a real experience in that field to know whether they are bacteria or symptoms that comes out on account of the fact that even though that they are in a larger open area, that's better than what they are now, but nevertheless, what is the symptoms or the problems that is being identified under that type of captivity?
So a few things. One is, again, we're not reinventing the wheel as far as sea pens are concerned. They already exist. The U.S. Navy has 70 dolphins in its sea pen facility in San Diego Harbor. So sort of laying the groundwork and setting the precedent for how you manage disease, for example, has already been done. In fact, some of the very best veterinarians, marine mammal veterinarians in the world have worked for the U.S. Navy program and have, addressed those issues. Crowding is really the problem in fish farms. We would absolutely avoid crowding because that's what we're trying to do, is give them more space per animal. Crowding is your issue in fish farming sea pens, because when you crowd prisons, anything, you crowd animals together, disease spreads. Yeah. So we would avoid that. But also the animals need to be screened for both active and inactive exposure to pathogens. Absolutely. We don't want to start any kind of epidemics. We want to help, not harm. Exactly. So we would absolutely take those things under consideration, and we would have the very best marine mammal vets consulting for us.
What about the waste?
That's
where does the
when
waste
I was
go?
talking about water turnover.
Yep.
That has to be addressed. There has to be good water turnover. Some sea pen facilities, dolphinariums, public display facilities are in very bad locations for that. They have picked a site for commercial reasons, not for ecological reasons, and the water flow in those particular sea pens is very poor. And what you end up with is algal overgrowth and, killing the coral locally. It's a problem. These dolphins put out a lot of waste. Cetaceans put out a lot of waste. So water turnover, not crowding, location, location, location.
And it's also the introductions to the other species to come in.
Absolutely.
That's another factor.
Thank you, Senator Watt. Senator Sinclair.
Thank you, Chair. I was curious about sea sanctuaries, particularly after the exchange between you and Senator Platt, and I was curious about the reference that he made to the Interprovincial Trade Act provision that you thought there was an exemption to. Were you thinking about the exemption that's in the bill relating to cetaceans currently in captivity and those taken into captivity because of assistance, or of something else?
I understood that there was, there's a couple of things. One is I thought there was an exemption for rescue and rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. I thought so. And also, as far as a facility, a seaside sanctuary being in Canada, well then you've got quite a few belugas, for example, 45 or more, that might need relocating to a sanctuary, so that they wouldn't be sent out of the country. In that case, they would stay within the country.
So you're not suggesting the sea sanctuary would go out and capture more cetaceans?
No, absolutely.
And put them in
no, sir.
Sea sanctuary?
No, sir.
Okay.
That is not its purpose.
And
the ultimate goal of a sanctuary, any sanctuary, whether it's for bears or tigers or elephants, is to go out of business.
Well, you seem to be trying to get into business, so I was just curious about how you were going to do that. So it's about the existing captive...
existing captive animals, no breeding, no imports, no captures. Again,
other than rescues.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Sinclair. And Senator Christmas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Laidlaw, I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, so I'm just going to try to make sure I did.
Okay.
So if we as a committee decided to take an impact study of Bill 203 on the Vancouver Aquarium and Marineland, am I hearing you saying that there would be little or no impact of this bill on those two facilities?
That's what I'm suggesting with 45 belugas, Marineland, who I think it's inevitable will change at some point in the not-too-distant future, whether it's through ownership change or other factors. They will still have animals in their tanks, probably equivalent to what other facilities currently use as viable numbers for display, possibly 15 or 20 or more years into the future. There's going to be a gradual diminishment, an incremental diminishment over time as deaths outpace births. But given the situation over the last 10 years or so, I expect that they would have animals for a very long time should they choose to keep the direction they're currently going. With regard to the Vancouver Aquarium, we've got some mitigating factors. The Vancouver Park Board just passed a motion for staff to develop a bylaw to ban cetaceans in Stanley Park. We don't know what the disposition or situation for the current cetaceans that are there now that are rescues will be, but certainly when it comes to new animals coming in, or even the loaned animals that are currently at SeaWorld, it looks like those animals will not be allowed. So there's a mitigating factor there, and as well, right after that announcement, the Vancouver Aquarium subsequently said, hey, we're getting out of the business anyway in 2029. So taking those things into consideration, and the 1996 voluntary pledge by the aquarium not to acquire wild-caught animals, I think all the evidence points to them getting out of the business. So I would suggest that if you're getting out of the business, then a law of this type will have minimal impact on what you do. And of course, they can still have rescues to do some of the things that they want to do.
Okay, so I did hear you correctly. You also mentioned there hasn't been a capture of a cetacean for 25 years?
1992, the John G. Shedd Aquarium, they had contractors as well as their own staff go to Churchill, Manitoba, to the Churchill River Estuary. They caught 4 belugas. 2 of them died because of I believe it was an inappropriate deworming medication within the first month. And then John Crosby, then DFO minister at the time, and I believe it was just ministerial decree. It was a policy that he said no more captures will be allowed for export to aquaria for public display purposes. So yeah, 25 years ago. Orcas, prior to that, it was in the 1970s. So we haven't had captures for a long time.
Okay, that's what I thought you said, Mr. Laidlaw, and I'm trying to understand what the issue is.
Capturing them was John Hicks.
Yes, who I met. I actually liked him a lot.
It doesn't seem to be an issue. So, anyway.
That's my belief. I think it's a lot of fuss about nothing because everything that's being suggested is already happening or is on the horizon in the not-too-distant future.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Christmas. Second round, Senator Platt. Sorry.
A lot of fuss.
I didn't have. Sorry. Yeah. Senator Nancy Green, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I really didn't have a question, but they are starting to rise now. And I just want you to comment, if you would, on an organization from California called Last Chance for Animals, and their tactics in I would say attacking marine land over the last few years, and just wanted to know if you were affiliated in any way with that organization.
No, ma'am.
Well, you can start first.
No, I'm not. My organization, Animal Welfare Institute, is not. Yeah. That's all I have to say about that. We're not affiliated with them.
Could you comment on their tactics?
My organization is mostly a policy organization. We work to change law, change regulation, change corporate policy. We're not direct action. All of us are PhDs and lawyers and, DVMs, and we're all working to, change policy. So the direct action that even, whether it's of any kind, just the direct action that a lot of activists choose to take, that's not our MO. That's not our method. I really prefer not to comment on it. It's not something we do. I certainly do not support breaking the law. I do not support violence. That's my personal position. It's certainly my organization's position, but it's my personal position as well. I don't know the details of what happened at Marineland. I happen to know that Mr. Holler has been violent, but I have direct personal experience with that. But that doesn't excuse it in any activist who's working to end what's going on there.
Mr. Holler is
the owner of Marineland.
Then I'll comment on my organization. We're also really more into the investigative research, policy development, and over the last number of years, litigations and animal rescue. We've never been a protest or a direct action organization. I've heard of Last Chance for Animals. They've been on the scene for many years, but other than reading what's in the newspaper, I've never had any contact with them, so can't really provide any commentary on what they actually did. I know it was an undercover investigation and it resulted in some type of litigation by Marineland, but that's really the extent of my knowledge as to that particular situation.
I just would like to say that I've been concerned for quite a few years about these direct action groups, and you know, I guess my interest first came with seeing the attack on the seal industry and knowing how important the seal is to the welfare of the Inuit people. And when the direct action groups wound up attacking and cutting off the market for seal products, the harm done to the Inuit people was absolutely incalculable. And so I don't appreciate those kind of groups who really raise money but spend most of it, very little of it, on the actual welfare of the animals and a lot on the activists group. So I don't see, I see that as a very unpositive way to create change, so I'm happy to hear that you don't...
I would also like to just state for the record that this comes up a lot in these sorts of forums, and you know, whereas in some ways I believe we are our brother's keeper, we can't keep answering for the actions of others. They are not our actions, and I find it troubling that it always comes back to that, and instead of actually grappling with the issues at hand. I just wanted to make that comment. We are not those organizations.
I appreciate that, but I think you would agree that public policy usually follows public opinion, and those kind of activists do impact.
And what I'm saying is that we can't stop them. We can't manage their actions. We are not their keepers. We are not their parents. We are not their bosses. We can't control them. I'm not saying they don't need to be controlled. I'm just saying we can't do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Nancy Green Rain. Last chance. Senator Platt.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of brief comments. Of course, Mr. Holder will be here to defend himself against that accusation that you just leveled against him, Ms. Rose, and I'm certainly looking
my personal
forward
experience,
to him,
sir.
Certainly looking forward to him doing that. I find that a little troubling that you would level an accusation against somebody who's not here to defend himself. Nevertheless, just also in reference to your comment about the killer whale at Marineland coming out of the water to put its head up to take fish rather than going down to catch it, I think we were told here the other day that somebody wanted to put personhood on whales, and I would tend to believe that this is what people do. They go to where the food is. If it's down low, they go down low, and if it's up high, they go high. I go to the dinner table at 6 o'clock. I think everybody does the same thing. You go where the food is, including whales, whether it's down on the sea bottom or up somewhere where somebody's feeding them. Let me just get this clear. Animal Welfare Institute does not rescue animals?
We are a policy organization. We work to change policy, sir.
Okay, yes or no, do you rescue animals?
Does that make a difference?
Yeah, it does. I'm asking a question, ma'am. I think we are the ones asking the question. I think we deserve answers. Do you rescue animals?
No, we do not. We do not own a shelter.
You do?
We do not run a shelter.
So you do not rescue animals?
That's not what we do, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Laidlaw, you said there's a lot of ado about nothing here because Marineland will stay in business. Wouldn't that be a two-way street then? If there's a lot of, if this is all about nothing, why do we need this bill if it won't have any impact positively or negatively? Is there any reason for us needing this bill?
Absolutely, because we're looking forward to the future and following the trend towards changing societal
the future
ethics.
Being 15 or 20 years from now when Marineland will go to business because of this law.
I think marine land will change regardless. I think it's inevitable. It's a very large property 5 minutes from the falls. We have an elderly owner. I would fully expect that the whole dynamic will change when the ownership of the property switches hands. Okay. And my guess would be that we'll no longer have a 1950s or 60s style amusement park with whales on the property.
Fair enough, but then what you said, that it has no impact on them because it's 15 or 20 years down the road, is only based on Mr. Holder will die and nobody will take over the business and they'll sell the property to the city of Niagara Falls. You have no proof that this would not have a negative impact on Mr. Holder's children if they want to take over, or his son if he wants to take over, or anybody else that wants to take over.
I think if you're talking if you're talking long-term impact, absolutely there could be long-term impact.
Can you describe, last question, Chair, can you describe the work Zoocheck undertakes specifically related to the preservation of species, wildlife protection, public education, and research, and approximately what percentage of your focus on each of these categories represents?
Oh, that's a very big question. We do a lot of different kinds of work. I would say that the majority of our work pertains to the keeping of wildlife in captivity, so that would include everything from animals in zoos and aquariums and those types of more traditional animal display facilities to animals used in the exotic pet trade, and it would continue on to animals in circuses and novelty acts and other type of transient or mobile situations as well. We also do a lot of work in terms of wildlife management policies. So right now we're working on management issues with regard to wild horses in Alberta. We're working with the Manitoba government on establishing the first ever bear rehabilitation center in the province of Manitoba. That was a recent policy change. We're engaged in quite a few of those kinds of things. We've also been active in funding field conservation work, so things that run along a continuum from sending scientists to important international meetings to funding anti-poaching aerial patrols in the lower Zambezi to buying weapons and equipment for anti-poaching patrols in Kenya, all different kinds of activities like that. It changes over time, but there's a whole continuum of activities, but most of them do revolve around funding field conservation initiatives that actually protect wildlife, wildlife management policy change in Canada, and then an assortment of issues pertaining to the keeping of wildlife in captivity.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Senator Flett. Senator Verga, you have a...
Chair, thank you very much. Yeah, both of you mentioned that there is no value to watching these cetaceans in the aquarium, that they do not create awareness, fascination, or any educational value to people who's watching. Is that what you just mentioned a while ago?
Well, I think just to sort of clarify that, there's no empirical evidence, no substantive body of empirical evidence that in fact occurs as these facilities say. And in fact, the evidence suggests, and I'm happy to provide dozens and dozens of papers to the committee if that's what's required to show you this, but the evidence actually suggests that there isn't the learning occurring as facilities claim, and there's no post-visit change in behavior that benefits animals.
Yeah, it doesn't create anywhere. Anyway, I just would like to mention to you that we know a person that by the name of Lawrence Schiller. She is currently completing her PhD in marine biology in Dalhousie University, because at 5 years old, 5 years old, she was inspired the Beluga named Kila, and that inspired her to become a marine biologist. And then as she was growing up, she continued to visit Kila, who has played an integral role in developing her love for the ocean and her passion for marine biology. And now she wants to take care of the whole ecosystem. I mean, anything to do with cetaceans. I mean, what would you say about her? I mean, she didn't learn it from her?
I'm a marine mammal biologist. I work within the scientific community, and I have a lot of friends who were inspired by a visit to the zoo. So your anecdote is extremely common, but it is an anecdote, and I would argue that your person, my friends, because they were raised by parents who sort of gave them that self-awareness or awareness, Could have been inspired otherwise. I was inspired from watching a really good nature special. I could tell you the story. It's very boring. So it varies from person to person, and I honestly believe that if we gave young people a different inspirational experience, which is what we're all talking about here today, that just as many young people would be inspired, and animals wouldn't have to suffer. That's all we're suggesting.
But you agree that it inspires some people, certain number of people, and then it creates awareness for a certain number of people, not necessarily according to your stats. So, right?
If all I'm saying is that, yes, some people may be inspired by a visit to a zoo or an aquarium, but animals are suffering at the same time. So I would like to come up with ways to inspire young people where there's the cost benefit is more in favor of the animals. That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Berger. And seeing no other hands or nods, I'm going to thank. Oh, sorry, Senator Gold. I see your nod. I forgot that. Sorry.
I see.
It is late.
You thought I was nodding off. I apologize. On many issues, ideological and political, one expects to see great divergence of views. I'm sure one experiences that in many walks of life. And the same is true in science. With regard to the issue of the impact of captivity on marine biological communities, we know your position, Dr. Rose. Is there controversy within the scientific community vis-a-vis this issue, or the related issue of the educational value, if you choose to go further? Or is there, to what degree is there a consensus or a large degree of consensus? Could you map the state of your colleagues' views on this for us, please?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you very much for it. Yes, there's controversy. My field is very young. The field of cetacean biology, where we were actually studying the whole animal, only started in the 1950s. It's a very young field. Prior to that, as you might remember from history, you caught a whale, you hauled it up on deck, and you cut it open, and that's how you studied it. Actually, studying them in situ alive just wasn't done prior to the 1950s. Some of the seminal, scientists who founded this field, studying the whole animal, some of them are still alive, but a lot of them only died very recently. I knew many of them. One of them was one of my mentors. He co-founded SeaWorld. So in the 1950s and 1960s, the scientific community felt that if you wanted to really get up close to a whole animal that was alive, you had to put it in a tank. And that's what they did. And they did start studying them in captivity in those days. And what they learned was to really get at what this animal is, you had to go out into the field. And the very same man who co-founded SeaWorld pioneered field work, because he realized that if you really wanted to know what a dolphin was, he had to get out into the field with it. And he pioneered the techniques for doing that. This is Dr. Kenneth Norris. All right. He died in 1994. I started in 1985. I knew him for 9 years. All right. It makes it very difficult for our community, our scientific community, to sort of disrespect our elders. And so it is extremely controversial. And even so, even though there's a history of respecting the giants in our field who studied these animals in concrete tanks back in the 50s and 60s, even so, our community is coming around to the consensus, as you put it, that yes, what you see in a tank is not actually an accurate avatar of a real whale or a dolphin. And if you really want to know what they're like, you have to go into the field. Hence, the aggressive development of new technologies. Remotely operated vehicles, drones, tags, I mentioned them earlier. The drive to develop that technology is because we are reluctantly, and I say reluctantly because we feel like we're disrespecting our elders, coming around to the agreement that the future of cetacean science is in the field. And I actually don't feel it's disrespecting them, because they didn't know. Science is learning. Science is always growing. Science is always developing new knowledge. We are not static. If it was okay in 1950, that doesn't mean it's okay in 2017. If it was the only way to do it in 1950, I sure hope it's not the only way to do it in 2017. I hope we've developed new ways to do whatever it is. And in this case, it's studying cetaceans. So the future of cetacean science is in the wild, and that's because when they're in a concrete tank, they really aren't representative. They don't hear the same way, they don't behave the same way, they don't contract diseases the same way. If we really want to understand why we're having die-offs along the Atlantic coast of bottlenose dolphins, we're not going to learn it solely by studying them in concrete tanks. Those studies can help, but they're not going to give us an accurate picture of what these animals are actually like when they're dealing with disease. So a growing number of scientists, well-respected current giants in the field, are coming around to the way of thinking that welfare is compromised in captivity, and that there are better ways of studying these animals than putting them in captivity. It does not mean that some good science is not being done in captivity. Some good science is still being done in captivity. Our goal in my community is to provide those opportunities in a more natural environment so that those animals do represent more accurately what the animals are like in the wild.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Gold, and thank all our senators and our witnesses for the very lively and interesting debate, and certainly adds much to our study. And we thank you for taking the time here this evening. I apologise again for our late start. We'll see you on Thursday morning, senators. Meeting adjourned.